Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Andy Pushlik. I'm the practice group leader for the Labor and Employment Group in Toronto. We have a really interesting presentation today for you. It goes without saying, now that we're about over 2 years into the pandemic, that the way that we work, the way that we view work has forever changed. Many of us have changed from our city desks to our kitchen tables. The lines between home and work have become blurred like never before. So it's against this backdrop that a discussion about the right to disconnect has emerged. And we are now no longer really talking about how such a law would work in theory, because we're now moving to practice. Late last year, Ontario became the first jurisdiction in Canada to introduce a law that will require employers to implement a disconnect from work policy. And that policy must be in place by June of this year. Understandably, this unique law has led to a lot of questions. And so to help guide you through these new developments, I'm pleased to be joined by several of our colleagues around the world where these laws are either in place or coming into place, because we thought that it would be helpful to get some lessons learned from those jurisdictions where the disconnect from work laws are already in place. We're going to start our presentation with the view from Ontario. And Emily Kroboth, who's an associate here in Toronto, she'll provide the update on what the Ontario government has already passed. Emily will be followed by our colleague Juan Alonso Barberena, who is an employment counsel in our Madrid office. Following Juan, we have Luca Dominic, who is a partner in a Milan office and will provide the view from Italy. And finally, Alison Weatherhead is based in Glasgow, sorry, Alison, and is the head of our People, Reward and Mobility practice in Scotland. And it has not been lost on me, as she's reminded us that in Central Europe right now, it is close to 6 p.m. So to be doing a disconnect from work policy on a Friday evening, there may be a bit of an oxymoron. So thanks so much to everyone for joining us today on the panel, and thanks to all of you, no matter where you sit, for joining us to hear about what I think is going to be a really interesting discussion. It's a lengthy presentation. There's a lot of content, but we are holding space for questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emily. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. And Emily, I will let you take everyone through what it means to have the disconnect from work policy in Ontario.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andy. So as Andy mentioned, my name is Emily and I'm an associate in our Toronto and Labor group. And if we could just get back to the first slide there for a moment. Thank you. So as many of you know, on October 25th, 2021, the Ontario government passed Bill 27, the Working for Workers Act. This bill contained an amendment to the Employment Standards Act, requiring employers to implement a policy with respect to disconnecting from work, so not a right to disconnect policy, by June 2nd, 2022. Currently, Ontario is the only province in Canada that has introduced this requirement. So in today's webinar, we will explore what that means for employers in Ontario and also look to other jurisdictions to see what may lay on the road ahead. So before we get started, let's go over some of the basics of this policy. So employers with 25 employees or more as of January 1st of any year require this policy. And this includes both part-time and casual employees along with full-time employees. Where an employer has multiple locations, all employees at each location count toward the 25 threshold. All employees must be provided with a copy of this policy within 30 days of the policy being prepared or updated. And employers must retain a copy of this policy for 3 years after the policy is no longer in effect. So just moving to the next slide, the Employment Standards Act defines disconnecting from work as not engaging in work-related communications, including emails, telephone calls, video calls, or the sending or reviewing of other messages, so as to be free from the performance of work. The legal requirement for a policy with respect to disconnecting from work is simply to have one. Currently, there are no specific requirements for the content of these policies. The Employment Standards Act states that the policy must contain information as may be prescribed, But at the moment, there are no regulations that explain exactly what this prescribed information is. So currently in Ontario, there isn't really a right to disconnect. There is simply a requirement for workplaces with 25 or more employees to have a policy that addresses disconnecting from work and what that means at your particular organization. The Ontario government's Guide to the Employment Standards Act explicitly states the ESA does not require an employer to create a new right for employees to disconnect from work and be free from the obligation to engage in work-related communications in its policies. Employee rights under the ESA to not perform work are established through other ESA rules. So for example, overtime pay. Ultimately, despite what we're seeing in the news or on social media, there is not yet a right to disconnect, and there is no legal requirement that you not contact employees outside of working hours. It is the employer who decides upon the actual contents of the policy. However, it's good to be aware that that may change if and when the government releases any regulations and provides further guidance on what the content of these policies should contain. So moving to the next slide, we've established that there are currently no explicit requirements regarding the content of a disconnecting from work policy. But that being said, practically speaking, what should your policy say? A lot depends on your organization. Are there some limits or boundaries that you can comfortably set and follow? Soon we'll hear from our colleagues about how other countries have approached the right to disconnect, but it might be a good idea to think about the following. For example, non-traditional working hours. We know that many parents, due to the pandemic, have had to become part-time teachers while still managing their full-time jobs. You might want to address non-traditional working hours in your disconnecting from work policy. What if you have parents who are dividing their days differently, maybe working very early in the morning or very late at night to accommodate for childcare? Another thing to think about is encouraging managers and leadership to send communications during regular working hours. Your policy could assist in creating a culture of communication mainly during work hours, if that works for your organization. A final thing to consider is disconnecting from work as a retention strategy. We are currently in the midst of what everyone is calling the Great Resignation. It could be worth thinking about how a disconnecting from work policy could be a part of your retention strategy. If you're getting feedback from exit interviews that touch on burnout, especially over the past 2 years of the pandemic, this policy could be a tool to benefit both employee well-being and overall retention. However, as a caveat to this, the Ontario Guide to the Employment Standards Act states that if employers give employees the right not to perform work, this may amount to a greater right or benefit and be enforceable under the ESA. This is important to keep in mind if you would like to use this as a retention strategy, as it will create additional and potentially legally enforceable obligations. If your policy on disconnecting from work does not create a greater right or benefit, this policy is not enforceable under the ESA. So moving to the next slide, some key takeaways regarding the right to disconnect in Ontario. I'll just remind you of what disconnecting from work means. It's defined as not engaging in work-related communications, including emails, telephone calls, video calls, or the sending or receiving of other messages, so as to be free from the performance of work. There is no real right to disconnect. At this moment in time, the employer decides the content of the policy with respect to disconnecting from work. And we really don't have a lot of guidance right now beyond that. Another takeaway is to maybe start thinking about what disconnecting might look like at your organization. Ultimately, we won't have any further clarity on what exactly the right to disconnect is until any regulations are released. What we do know, however, is that employers need this policy in place by June 2nd, 2022. As Andy mentioned earlier, the Toronto Labour and Employment Group has prepared a draft disconnecting from work policy, along with a frequently asked questions document that you may use for your organization. If and when any regulations are released, we'll be updating this policy and circulating it to anyone who has received the initial policy. Now, at this point, I'd like to pass it off to our colleagues from Italy, Spain, and Scotland to hear about how other jurisdictions have approached the right to disconnect and what they recommend to their clients regarding this right. We will begin by hearing from my colleague Juan, who will be discussing what the right to disconnect looks like in Spain.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Juan Alonso. I'm counsel on the Employment Department in Madrid office of Dentons. And I would like to talk a little bit about what is digital disconnection and making an executive approach of this. Please, next slide. Yeah. Well, let's start saying that digital disconnection has not a specific regulation. There are general regulations that are not details, and it is based on a subjective scope that it is applicable to every employee, including teleworkers, because the pandemic affects the digital disconnection and teleworking has an increased impact on employment relationships, and also for employees who works at premises. Digital disconnection, it is not applicable to self-employees or consultants because they are the own manager of their working time. The objective scope of digital disconnection is just limited to use of IT tools outside of the working times. And these are the two important part of digital disconnections. But there is also an appendix that it is related with IT control system by the employer and geolocalization. This objective scope will be managed and will be taken into account in order to protect the interest that digital disconnection should have to provide. In this sense, the first protected interest is obviously to combine the personal and professional life. Also, the working time against the resting period. The third protected interest would be intimacy, and it is linked with the IT control system and geolocalization. That means if an employee outside of the working time is managed by the company by IT control system on geolocalization, it is a clear infringement on digital disconnections. And the fourth protected interest, it would be the employee's health. It is regulated under a general scope of health and safety law, and it is very important because the employer must take care of the employee's health. But if psychological effects would arise, and especially burnout effects regarding digital disconnection, it could lead a problem for the company with very specific sanctions. And also regarding working accidents, it could have a very huge impact for the companies. Imagine that, for example, an employee is working or being controlled after the outside of the working time, and he suffers an accident. An accident could be that he dies. What is considered as working accident? Because working accident has a special contribution rate on Social Security, and the pension allowance is higher than if it is not a working accident. So if the employee is not on working time, how can we manage that it would be a working or not working accident? It is very important part according to Spanish law. Regarding regulation, I have stated that there are general rules. It is the Workers' Statute, the Teleworking Act, Data Protection Law, Health and Safety Law that we have discussed about that, and collective bargaining agreements that usually has special covenants regarding digital disconnections. Also, internal companies policy, which is mandatory to include a digital disconnection on them, and employment contracts that will manage the digital disconnection, including a specific provision on this, or also limiting it, as we will see in the following slide, stating what is the working time, resting periods, etc. What are the consequences of infringing the digital disconnection rule, administrative fines up to 225,000 euros, moral harassment, because employees could say, okay, I have been harassed because the company cannot provide me with a very policy on digital disconnection, working accidents that could be suicides, could come back to the previous slide, so thank you. And finally, the employee's request to terminate the contract. That means the employee, if he sees or she sees that the employment rights are infringed, he could be entitled to terminate the contract, receiving a severance compensation plus damages. Please go to the forward to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. Well, digital disconnection is linked with 4 pillars. The first one would be working time. On a workers' statute, that it is the employment law and the collective bargaining agreement, is stated the maximum daily, monthly, weekly, and annual working time that the employees must carry out their duties. And also it is important to highlight that according to Spanish law, every employee must register their working time on daily basis using the company's IT tools or whatever mechanism that the companies may implement. So this is the key point in order to control whether digital disconnection must start. If the employee is working more time than the stated in the contract, in the workers' statute, etc., we arrive to overtime. Overtime in Spain is limited to 80 hours per year an employee, and it must be compensated with resting period, at least 4 months after a starting date of the work overtime, or with an amount that it is usually fixed in the collective bargaining agreement. Overtime must be contributed to the social security to a special rate. The third pillar would be the availability of the employee, that it is what several companies call on-call duties. It is not effective working time, but it must be remunerated. And it means that the employee must be available to attend any emergencies or any requirement of the company. So it must be linked with digital disconnections. And finally, the fourth pillar will be resting periods. Resting periods must be respected, and digital disconnection must be applied regarding daily resting period, weekends, bank holiday, or remunerated permits. For example, if an employee goes to marriage, he has 15 days of remunerated permit, whether the digital disconnection must be applied. Please go for the next slide. Thank you. Just to finish, we are going to analyze 3 short managing cases, 3 short cases regarding all these things that I have tried to summarize in an executive approach. Imagine, for example, an employee is always on long trips, and there are 2 possibilities. During the long trip, for example, from Spain to Canada, the employee is traveling. Is it a working time? It is not. It's available. What's happened with this situation? Is he entitled to ask for digital disconnection? It depends on each case, but if the employee is working during the trip, it is acknowledged that it is effective working time. If he's not working, but he's available, it is possible that he will be on call. And if he's doing other things that it is not related with the working time, it should not be considered as working time, and he will be on digital disconnection. But the employee could say, okay, yes, but I'm not in this plane because it is my holiday. It is because I have received an instruction from the company to be here for a meeting. So I'm indirectly working. This case must be taken care and must be managed case by case, because the employee could say that I'm on overtime, or the digital disconnection rules are breaching. by the company. The second case would be the case of an employee that received 25 emails in a sequence for a minute. That's mean 25, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the same minute after 22 hours by night. What's happened? The employee could say, okay, I'm going to file several procedures against you because you are moral harassment and you are not respecting the digital disconnection. In this case, for example, we could have a meeting with the general manager, that this is the person who sent the 25 emails, and he explains, okay, I was traveling, I usually travel, I work in the plane, and when I'm connecting in Wi-Fi, every emails that I have drafted are sent. So it is not a moral harassment because it is not focused on one person, but for everybody in the company. And the employee is free to answer these emails or to even open the IT tool. So it is not breaching the digital disconnection. And the third case, it would be the situation regarding emergencies during holidays and losing the rights. In Spain, the holidays must be spent during the calendar year that it is from January to December. If an employee is requested to work during the holiday, it's possible that he loses the right to get holiday. So the company is infringing the digital disconnection because holiday could not benefit by the employee full time, and also the risk that the employee lose the right to get new holiday. In order to manage it, usually companies are flexible, saying that for your case, and in this particular year, we are going to provide you with additional days or additional weeks that could be spent even in the following year. Well, these are more or less the global picture of the digital disconnection in Spain, and I hope that it would be useful for you. Thank you very much.
Hello to everybody. Thanks, Juan. My name is Luca Demenec. I'm a partner of the Labor Department here in the Milan office. And in the next 10 minutes, I will give you an overview on the right to disconnect in Italy. First of all, for the time being, in Italy, we do not have a legal definition on of the right to disconnect. And however, from a substantial standpoint, according to the practice, the right to disconnect in Italy refers to the right of the employee to disconnect from work and to refrain from engaging and managing work-related electronic communications such as emails, call, video call, and so on, of course, outside the working hours. Being a right for the employee, the exercise of this right by the employee cannot entail negative consequences on the employee. And then, such as, for instance, the starting of disciplinary procedure in charge of him, her, or retaliatory measures, including, of course, the dismissal of the employee. The aim of the right to disconnect, as considered in Italy, is to ensure and grant the protection of employees' health and safety, and grant a fair working condition, including the concept of work-life balance. The right to disconnect become increasingly important, very important in the last 2 years, as a consequence of the massive use of the remote working in Italy that before was used in very few cases. If we move on to the next slide. Just to give you some data on the use of remote working in Italy. On 2018, in Italy, 2% of the employees worked in remote working instead of an average, European average of 11.6%. And moving on the next slide. At the beginning of the COVID period, January, February 2020, the average was in Italy of employees in remote working 1.2%, and during the lockdown 8.8%, and if we consider medium and large companies, for example, companies of more than 250 employees, the percentage, we recorded a percentage up to 30%. And then substantially 1 every 4 employee during the lockdown was working in a remote working. If we go on. To understand how is it declined the right to disconnect in Italy, it is important to have an overview of the rules related to the smart working in Italy. Because in Italy we have substantially 2 rules, 2 different disciplines regarding the remote working. The first one is the so-called smart working, and that is regulated by a law. The law dated 2017, number 81, and according to the smart working, the employee that is a particular way of performing the working activity. The employee can perform the activity outside of the company's office without any constraints in relation to time and the place of work, and with the use of technological instruments. The smart working requires necessarily the consent of the employees, because it is necessary an agreement between the employer and the employee, except at the moment up to 31 of March, because during this period, that is the period in which is enforced the state of emergency, it is possible for the employer to put an employee smart working without any agreement, and then without his consent. The second rule related to the remote working is the so-called teleworking. That is very similar to the smart working, even though in this case there is no flexibility on the workplace, but the employee must perform the activity in a specific workplace, of course, outside from the office of the company. The teleworking, differently from the smart working, is regulated not by the law, but by a collective bargaining agreement dated 2004. And also in this case, it is necessary to have an agreement and then the consent of the employee to implement the teleworking. So the main difference between these 2 rules refers to the workplace and the working hours, because with reference to the smart working, there is flexibility. The employee can perform the activity everywhere, while in the teleworking, the employee must have a specific place of work outside of the company. In smart working, the employee has also flexibility in terms of working hours. Of course, must respect the maximum provisions set forth, thresholds set forth by the law in terms of daily and weekly working hours. And while in the teleworking, the specific working time must be expressly regulated. And these are the difference. In the next slide, we can see instead the common features of smart working and teleworking, because Both of them requires the consent of the employee, except until 31 of March for smart working, and both of them, of course, with the different items considering the specific agreement, can provide also for termination withdrawal from right from this agreement. So, coming back to the right to disconnect in Italy. While I made this introduction on the different kind of remote working, because the right to disconnect in Italy is expressly provided only for employees in smart working and not for employees in teleworking. This is the main reason. And if we go to the next slide, with reference to the smart working, and then the only law that provides the right to disconnect, this right to disconnect is set forth by Section 19 of the law which regulates the smart working, according to which it states that the individual agreement necessary to implement the smart working must provide, among others, also for the technological and organizational measures necessary to ensure the disconnection of the employee from the technological work equipment. So this is the main, but actually the only provision in Italy related to the right to disconnect. And as you can see, it's a very generic provision. Because first of all, let the content of the right to disconnect to the will of the parties and to the agreement of the parties. So the positive point is that we have an express right provided by the law, but this right, as we can see in the next slide, has very weak points, because it is, as I said, is led to the content of this right is led to the will of the parties, and as we know, 99% of the cases, the employer has a contractual power stronger than the employee, and then probably a better solution in this case by our government would have been to let the agreement not to the parties, employee and employer, but to the collective parties, so association of employer and trade unions. The other weak point of this provision is that it refers only to the employees in smart working, and then not, for example, to other kind of employees such as self-employees or teleworker employees. And above all, there are no sanctions in case of breach of this right to disconnect. After the introduction of this section 19, related, as I said, only to the smart working, considering the importance, the increasing importance of this right, several contributions occurred. And first of all, the first one comes from the Italian Data Protection Authority, that with an act dated May 2020, stated that it should also be ensured more clearly than already provided, so he refers to the current law, that right to disconnect, without which there is a risk of nullifying the necessary distinction between private life space and work activity. So also our authority, Data Protection Authority, confirmed the importance of the right to disconnect in relation to the employment relationships. The second contribution in the next that we can see in the next slide is the resolution of the European Parliament that gave us a content of the right to disconnect, stating that the right disconnect is the right of employees not engaged in work-related tasks or communication outside the working hours. And in order of time, a further contribution in the next slide refers to another Italian law dated 2021, another generic phrase, because this law stated that it is recognized to the employee who performs the activity smart working the right to disconnect from technological instruments and computer platforms in accordance with the agreements signed by the parties. If we can say that this law seems to extend this right to disconnect in general to all the employees and then also to teleworkers, because in the Italian wording there is a generic reference to smart working. And the other important point of this law is the second part of the phrase, in which it states that the exercise of the right to disconnect necessary to protect the employees cannot have consequences on the employment relationship or on pay. So give to the employee a protection on this regard. A further contribution in the next slide is, I think this is the most important one, the draft law that currently has been sent to the Labor Commission of our government, so is under discussion. And this draft law tries to give specific details and to provide specific details of the disconnection right into the agreement that must be signed to implement smart working and teleworking. And for example, the draft law provides that in the agreement must be identified the employees' rest time, as well the technical and organizational measures necessary to ensure the disconnection, must recognize outside the working time the right to disconnect, and in this case gives for the first time a specific definition of the right to disconnect, stating that is the right of the employees who perform smart working to disconnect from technological tools and so on. According to the draft law, the agreement must also provide that the employee supervises the right to disconnection in order to allow the employee to recover psychophysical energies. And above all, discussions are ongoing in our government, by our government, on the possibility to provide fines and sanctions in case of breach of the disconnection right by the employer. That I think is the most important point to protect the employee. Last one contribution in the next slide is the national protocol signed some months ago, December 2021, which confirms the importance of the right to disconnect and which extends the right to disconnect also the specific case of absence from work, such as illness, accidents, vacations, and so on. This is the legal background. Our recommendation for the time being, considering the very generic formulation of the law, for the moment, as we can see in the next slide, is to provide clauses quite generic for the employer, such as these ones, and then, for example, that outside ordinary working hours, the employee will have the right to disconnect from technological instruments and computer platforms, and except introducing some exception. For example, except for specific and exceptional business needs of an urgent nature, or unless it has been requested in advance time to time by the manager, also in this case for exceptional business needs and urgent needs. The last recommendation is that, of course, the right to disconnect and the provision related to the right to disconnect must be compliant with the provision of the working hour, because we don't have, according to our law, sanctions in case of breach of the right to disconnect, but of course the employer must respect the working hours provisions, and in this case, in case of breach of the working hours provisions, the employer is subject to specific sanctions. I finished. Thank you.
Thanks, Luca. I'm stepping in at this point and I'm going to be speaking about the position in Scotland. I'm Alison Weatherhead and I'm a partner in the practice based in the west coast of Scotland. And it's been very interesting to hear from my colleagues in Ontario and also in Spain and Italy. If you move to the next slide, please. In Scotland, we're very much in the foothills of this, very much just starting to think about disconnect. Scotland has a devolved government which is responsible for some matters separate from the UK government. Employment law is not one of them, but the Scottish government is looking at introducing some changes in the public sector, and they have done that through their public sector pay policy, which is launched at the end of last year and will be effective for the financial year April 22 to April 23. And what they've included in that is a fairly bland sounding requirement to enter into meaningful discussions between public sector employers and their staff representatives about the right to disconnect. At the moment, we don't have much more than that. There will be a technical guidance document which will come out from the Scottish Government before April, which will set out what those discussions might look like. But it's very much envisaged that there'll be a discussion between the local government employer and their staff representatives. Typically in Scotland, that will be the recognised trade union. We have a very strong trade union movement in Scotland, and looking to agree on a job-by-job basis the opportunity to disconnect. So at the moment, it's fairly light touch. It's not going to be in legislation. As we say at the moment, we're not entirely sure if the Scottish Government can legislate on that separate from the UK Government. But it's certainly part of a pattern of movement that the Scottish Government is making in this sort of social policy area, and connected really with two other things that they're doing. One of which is that they're trialling in a number of places a 4-day working week within public organisations in Scotland. And they're asking any both public and private employers who wish to be supported in trialling that to come forward and be part of that trial period. It's something they're very much pushing. And that is connected with the extent to which people in Scotland did work from home and did work adjusted hours during the COVID pandemic, both because of workplace restrictions, which we still have some of those in place, and also what we call furlough arrangements, which were the arrangements where people worked reduced time and received pay through the public purse. The other thing that's interesting in that social policy sphere, which is connected with the right to disconnect on the 4-day working week, is that as we come out through the end of the sort of formal COVID measures, in Scotland, which are due to come to an end on the 21st of March, when we will be removing the requirement, for example, to wear masks on transport and in retail centres, what the Scottish Government is saying is that in the context of the right to disconnect, a 4-day working week, they are also looking at they're also expressly saying that they would like people to continue to work in a hybrid way where it's possible and appropriate, and that should continue to be part of the routine measures which remain in place even when the risks of COVID are viewed to be low. So taking that as a combination, it's quite an interesting step by the Scottish Government in terms of social policy to look at all of these things as one suite of documents and approaches as we come through COVID. And they are very much tagging it into that, needing to look after people's well-being. So very similar to some of the messages that came from Italy and Spain, but actually being introduced in quite a different way. So intending it to be local conversations as opposed to something else more mandatory. So it's going to be something that we're going to be interested to watch in Scotland, because where the Scottish Government goes first in terms of public arrangements, quite often if you then want to provide services to the government or work with them, you need to demonstrate that you're aligning your own policies with the approach taken by the government. So it can sometimes have a little bit of a spread out measure in that way as well. So as I say, very much first foray in Scotland and in the UK as compared to my European colleagues and indeed those in Ontario. So at this point, I was going to pass back to Andy and Emily, who are going to, I think, chair the next part of this session. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to everyone for their really helpful and informative presentations. And we've got a number of questions. We'll try and get through a few points before we come up to the top of the hour. So Emily, I'm going to start with you. One of the areas that's garnered a lot of action on the Q&A function is that 25 employee threshold, and whether or not, if you have 5 employees in Ontario, but you have 20 employees in BC, are you meeting that threshold? So what is the guidance right now in terms of how employers should view the 25 employee threshold?
Thanks, Andy. So the Ministry of Labor has clarified in its guide to the Employment Standards Act that the threshold is 25 employees in Ontario specifically.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Now, Luca and Juan, Spain and Italy and the other jurisdiction that we don't have on today is France. Those seem to be the countries that are the furthest ahead in terms of implementing these types of laws. And you went over some really helpful information about things that they should have in their policies. And Juan, you referenced a few case studies as well. Are you aware of any penalties where an employer has either breached or not followed, or there's been a complaint where an employer has been prosecuted under these laws?
It's not directly related with disconnection, digital disconnection, but there are important penalties for overtime and not respecting the mandatory working time or holiday. So at the moment, there is not important sanctions for digital disconnection, but linked with this, yes, there is. Regarding the possibility of implementing a new law, developing the workers' statute, the general provision in the workers' statute, it could be possible, but I think that the employer associations would like to reject it because in practice, everybody works more than the statutory working time. The only limit that it is functioning here in Spain is the registering of daily working time, and the labor inspection is punishing several companies because they have not the register or they have not properly implemented this register.
Luca, what about Italy?
Yes, it is substantially the same in Italy because, as I said, we don't have sanctions in case of breach of the right to disconnect, but the labor inspectors and the labor office is very careful in verifying a situation of breaches of working time hours, extra working time, and so on. And in this case, the employer is subject both to the potential sanctions provided by the law and to the request of the employees, consequences request of the employees related to the extra time, salary, and so on. In my opinion, I think that with the draft law, probably a possible sanction on the breach of the right to disconnect will be introduced. Even though I think that the main sanctions will be linked and related to the working hours.
This maybe is a question for the entire panel. We've had a question come in about if you have a company that's operating in a lot of jurisdictions and some of these jurisdictions have this right to disconnect policy, do you have any practical advice about trying to navigate these various laws and whether you should be going to the most stringent or how you should be dealing with it. My sense, just to open it up, is that, and Alison, I'll go to you first after, is at least in Ontario, things are so early days. I'd probably be careful about even implementing a policy right now, and really looking at the definition of what it means to be disconnected from work. Alison, I know you do a lot of work with multinational countries that are trying to navigate lots of different jurisdictional requirements. Any guidance on how you would go about a cross-jurisdictional policy?
I think that's right. I think one of the really, it's really attractive to have a one-size-fits-all policy, because then you know if you're dipping in and out of different countries, you know what the rule is, because it's one size for everybody. But with something that is so interlinked with annual holiday, working time, wages, and the different definitions, and because we're still so early in so many jurisdictions, my recommendation would be to keep it really flexible and have some sort of catch-all, which is that, you know, we will respect or act in compliance with the local requirements in respect of any right to disconnect, and then perhaps have a country addendum for those countries like Italy or Spain where there are specific requirements. And I think specifically thinking about what Luke has been speaking about, how that there are perhaps different rights depending on different kinds of industries as well, the different way that you work, so that you could be a company that is in both, not only in different jurisdictions, but has different types of workers. And I notice a few people, for example, have been asking about 24/7 operations and those connections. And that's why having a sort of one size fits all, it's going to be very challenging to do that, where you have people working, for example, on shift patterns, because how do you define what is working time in a standard policy if you have somebody whose normal working time is actually 10 o'clock at night? And it's good. So I think I think the place to watch is Europe. I think Europe is as is often the case. The European Parliament is very forward thinking on these things, and I see that as a country that's no longer subject to the European rules. And so I think, you know, watching what the European Parliament does, and then how the trade bodies in the likes of Italy and Spain and France then really push the rules forward, because that's where you know the European countries really are very good at getting some specifics on this stuff. So it's been great to hear from my perspective. I've learned a lot from Spain and Italy today, so thanks, guys.
Luca, anything to add about if I don't know if you've had that come up already in your practice with any of your clients who are trying to navigate multi-jurisdictional requirements for this particular type of law?
Yes, I think that in these cases, according to Spanish law, since digital disconnection is not stated, that digital disconnection is start at 7 o'clock in the afternoon up to 9 o'clock in the morning. And it was a real case, if some employees will have to be connected by night because, for example, in US, it is requested their services for whatever reason, for example, for IT reasons, they must be connected, and obviously it is working time, and they will benefit of resting periods along the other slots of the day.
Great, thanks, Juan. Emily, I'm going to go back to you. A very quick question and then a follow-up. Some people are asking, do you have any sense or have you heard when the regulations, or if there are going to be any regulations from the Ontario government on what should be in these policies?
Thanks, Andy. So unfortunately, there has been radio silence. We don't know if or when any regulations will be released. So right now it's a little bit tricky to navigate, but we'll keep an eye out and if there are any regulations published.
And just on that point, because a lot of people are asking, you know, what should we have in the Ontario policy? Can you just go over again what the flexibility is for employers at this moment? Because my sense is that it's extraordinarily broad.
Yeah, so that's right. It is incredibly broad. The Guide to the Employment Standards Act explicitly says the employer decides the content of the policy. So there really is a lot of flexibility to determine what disconnecting from work looks like for you and your organization.
So on that point, Luca and Juan, when you've had clients look at these types of policies, in terms of just some basics, like how long are the policies that your clients have been implementing? Are they very, very long? Are they using best practices? Are they using examples? How have you seen clients structure these?
Andy, in Italy, for the moment, also in the policy, the right to disconnect is provided in a very generic way, but voluntarily, because we are waiting for specifications by the draft law and better specification by the legislator, and also above all, for the moment, as far as I know, we don't have any case law on the breach of right to disconnect that could give us an extension of this right and possible consequences on this. So for the moment, our suggestion is both in the agreement of the remote working and in the policy to keep this right on high level, and for sure to provide for exceptions, because from a substantial standpoint in Italy, considering that there are no sanctions in case of breach, in the practice, the employees continues to work, or in any case to answer to emails also after the working time. So it's very important to provide exceptions, and of course, if the concerned employee should challenge this in front of the court, we can have something to protect the company. But the main suggestion for the moment is to keep the provision on high level.
Yeah, in Spain, it's almost the same. And the trick and the specific rule is to limit the digital disconnection right to objective circumstances. That means production and organizational grounds. That means if the company needs you to work, even if you are disconnected, the company may compensate you, but you will have to provide services. This is the key point in order to include in the policies.
Well, look, thank you so much to everyone on the panel, our friends from Scotland, Spain, Italy, and of course, Toronto. And thank you to all of you who have tuned in.